There is a phrase in the Gospel of John that appears 5 times. 5 times across 14 chapters, the same formula surfaces. The disciple whom Jesus loved. Sometimes it is the other disciple. Sometimes the one Jesus loved. But the formula is consistent, deliberate, and this is the thing that stopped me cold when I first really looked at it. Completely anonymous. No name. In any of the 5 appearances, the author of the 4th Gospel built an entire narrative around a figure so close to Jesus that he reclines against him at the Last Supper. So close that from the cross, dying, Jesus entrusts his mother to this disciple's care. So close that when Mary Magdalene runs from the empty tomb, it is this disciple she goes to tell. And in 21 chapters of the most theologically dense gospel in the New Testament, this person, the most intimate witness to the life and death of Jesus, is never once named. Now, every other gospel names everyone. Mark names the disciples, names the women at the tomb, names Bartimaeus the blind man, names Simon of Cyrene and his sons. Luke names Joanna and Susanna among the women who followed Jesus. Matthew names the 12. The Gospel of John names Mary Magdalene, names Lazarus, names Nicodemus, names Thomas's specific doubt, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, names everything and everyone, except this one person. That is not an accident. That is a choice. And the question, the one I have been working through for the better part of 2 years, is what is being protected by that choice? Because here is what I was taught, what most people who have sat through church have been taught. The beloved disciple is John, John the son of Zebedee, one of the 12, the author of the Gospel. He writes himself anonymously out of humility, some traditions say, a modest refusal to name himself in his own account. It is a beautiful story. It is also, when you go to the actual text, completely unsupported by anything the text says. I need to show you how that attribution happened. And I need to show you what the text actually points toward when you read it the way Spinoza taught us to read Scripture. As a human document, stripped of tradition, examined for what the words themselves say and what they conspicuously do not say. Let me give you Spinoza's method first, because it is the lens that makes everything else visible. In 1670, Spinoza published the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus. It was banned almost immediately, and it has been quietly unsettling institutions ever since. His central claim about Scripture was this: read the Bible the way you would read any other ancient document. Ask who wrote it, when, and why. Do not import theological presuppositions into your reading. Let the text speak for itself, even when what it says is inconvenient. This sounds obvious. It was, in the 17th century, revolutionary enough to get him excommunicated and his book burned. But apply that method to the Gospel of John, and something immediately strange appears. The Gospel identifies its founding witness explicitly. In John 21, verse 24, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. That is the author making a direct claim about the beloved disciple. This is my source. This is the witness. Fine. Now ask the next question. Where is John, son of Zebedee, in this gospel? Barely there. In the synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, Peter, James, and John are the inner circle. They are at the Transfiguration. They are in the Garden of Gethsemane. They are the 3 whom Jesus takes apart from the rest. John, son of Zebedee, is, in Mark's account, one of the 2 men Jesus calls first. He is present at every critical moment. In the Gospel of John, he is mentioned by name exactly twice. Both times in chapter 21, the final chapter, which many scholars believe was added to the Gospel as a later appendix, not part of the original document. Outside of that appendix, John, son of Zebedee, does not appear by name at any critical moment of the narrative. Not at the Last Supper, not at the cross, not at the empty tomb, not in the resurrection appearances. The beloved disciple is at all of those moments. John is at none of them. Spinoza's first principle applied to this text. When the traditional attribution creates a contradiction the text cannot resolve, the attribution is wrong. Now let me tell you when the attribution was made, because this is not ancient. This is not from the 1st century. This is not from anyone who knew Jesus or the 12. The first extant writer to claim that John, son of Zebedee, wrote the 4th Gospel was Irenaeus of Lyon. He made this claim around 180 AD, approximately a century after the events the Gospel describes. Irenaeus was writing to combat Gnostic Christian communities who used the Gospel of John as a foundational text for their own theology. His strategy was to anchor the fourth Gospel to an apostle, to give it authority in what was becoming the emerging Catholic canon. He chose John, son of Zebedee, and his reasoning was in large part practical. John was the last surviving apostle, already associated with the city of Ephesus, which was also where the Johannine community appeared to be based. The connection was geographically convenient and theologically useful. Earlier church writers do not make this claim. Papias of Hierapolis, who wrote in the early 2nd century and actually knew people who had known the apostles, distinguished between two figures named John the Apostle and John the Elder, and his language suggests these were different people. Justin Martyr, writing around 150 AD, uses the Gospel of John and does not name its author. Clement of Alexandria does not identify the beloved disciple as John, son of Zebedee, in the way Irenaeus does. The attribution came from Irenaeus, one man, writing a century after the fact, for polemical purposes. And Spinoza warned us explicitly in the Tractatus, chapters 7 and 8, against trusting traditional attributions when the internal evidence of a text points in a different direction. He applied this specifically to Mosaic authorship. He would have applied it here. The question is not what tradition says. The question is what the document says. I want to give the strongest alternative argument its due before we go any further, because I am not interested in winning a debate. I am interested in following the evidence. The strongest alternative to Mary Magdalene as the beloved disciple is Lazarus. The case is textually serious. John 11 verse 3, the sisters of Lazarus send word to Jesus that the one you love is sick. Verse 5, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Verse 36, when Jesus weeps at the tomb, see how he loved him. These are the only times before the beloved disciple passages begin in chapter 13 that the specific verb of love, agapao, is applied to a named individual in the Gospel of John. Lazarus is the first person Jesus is explicitly said to love in this Gospel. The argument, advanced by Floyd Filson in the 1959 biblical archaeologist, expanded by Oscar Cullmann, and developed more recently by Ben Witherington, is that Lazarus is the beloved disciple hiding his own identity, which would explain the anonymity, because a man Jesus had publicly raised from the dead would have been a marked person, hunted by the authorities. I spent weeks with this argument. I found it genuinely compelling at first, and then I found the crack. A few years back, I was working through Raymond E. Brown's The Community of the Beloved Disciple. Brown was one of the most rigorous Johannine scholars of the 20th century, and this particular book, from 1979, is one of the most careful reconstructions of who the Johannine community was, what they believed, and who their founding witness might have been. I had found a copy at the UT Hodges Library, an older hardback with library markings on the spine, the kind of book that had clearly been checked out many times and handled by many different hands. I was working through the section where Brown addresses the Lazarus hypothesis, and in a footnote he did something I didn't expect. He hedged. Brown, who spent his career on the Gospel of John, quietly acknowledged that the Lazarus identification creates problems he could not fully resolve. Not in the main text, in a footnote. The kind of careful, scholarly retreat that happens when a man is not quite willing to commit to what he suspects. And someone, in pencil, in the margin of that library copy, next to Brown's footnote, had written 2 words. Then who? I sat with that for a long time. It felt like a stranger reaching across 30 years to ask the exact question I was sitting with. Then who? That question sent me back to the Nag Hammadi catalogue and to John 19, because here is the textual problem with Lazarus that Brown's footnote was circling. In John 12 verse 10, we are told that the chief priests were planning to kill Lazarus because on account of him, many Jews were going over to Jesus. Lazarus was not safe. Lazarus was a fugitive from the religious authorities. But in John 19 verse 26, the beloved disciple is standing at the foot of the cross, in public, in Jerusalem, during the trial and execution of the most wanted man in Judea at that moment, standing there openly enough that Jesus can see him from the cross and speak to him. A man being hunted for his life does not stand at the foot of the cross in full view of the Roman soldiers and the temple guard. The chronology breaks. The beloved disciple at the cross is someone who could be publicly present without fear of immediate arrest. Lazarus could not have been that person. The text will not allow it. Then who? Let me tell you about a scholar named Ramon K. Jusino. He is not as famous as Brown or Cullmann or Witherington. He published his argument in 1998 in a paper called Mary Magdalene, author of the Fourth Gospel. It did not receive the mainstream attention it deserved. It appeared in a smaller venue. It has been sitting in academic footnotes ever since. Jusino's argument is structural. He analyzed the beloved disciple passages in John, all 5 of them plus the appendix, and identified what he called redactional seams, places in the text where the grammar shifts, where the narrative logic wobbles, where the editorial hand of a later writer appears to have intervened in an original document. His claim is specific. In the original version of what became the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple was named, and the name was Mary Magdalene. A later editor, working in the early 2nd century as the Johannine community was being absorbed into the emerging Catholic Church, changed Mary Magdalene to the anonymous formula, the disciple whom Jesus loved, adding masculine pronouns throughout as editorial cover. The masculinization of the text was the redactional act. The original document had a female founding witness. Jusino's evidence for this is the behavior of Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of John, compared to her behavior in the other 3 Gospels. In Mark, the earliest Gospel, Mary Magdalene appears for the first time at the crucifixion. She is one of several women who watched from a distance. She is important, but not singular. In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene's role is structurally unique. She is the first person at the empty tomb, not the first woman, the first person. She runs to tell Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. She stays at the tomb when the male disciples leave. She is the first person to whom the risen Jesus appears. Jesus gives her a specific mission: go and tell my brothers. The Greek word used is the same word used to commission the apostles. In the 4th Gospel, Mary Magdalene is the primary resurrection witness, commissioned by the risen Jesus himself to carry the news. In no other Gospel does she receive this kind of structural prominence. Why would a Gospel built around a founding witness named John give Mary Magdalene the most authoritative moment in the entire resurrection narrative? The answer that Jusino proposes, the answer that Spinoza's method suggests, is that the Gospel of John was built around Mary Magdalene. She was the founding witness. She was the one who testified. She was the source from which the Johannine community drew its identity and its theology. And someone later changed her name. There is a document from the Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945, a collection of early Christian texts that were buried and hidden, while the emerging church was deciding which documents would be permitted to survive, called the Gospel of Philip. The Gospel of Philip is not a gospel in the narrative sense. It is a collection of theological reflections, probably from a Valentinian Gnostic community, dated to the 3rd or 4th century. But it is widely believed to preserve traditions and community memories that are much older, potentially originating in communities that stood in the Johannine lineage. And in the Gospel of Philip, there is a passage about Mary Magdalene. The companion of the Savior is Mary Magdalene, but Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth. Set aside the theological implications for a moment. Focus on the grammatical construction. Christ loved her more than all the disciples. The comparative formula, loved more than all the others, is nearly identical in structure to the beloved disciple formula in John. The disciple whom Jesus loved, used in contexts that clearly distinguish this figure as singularly intimate. The Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of John are using the same grammatical language to describe the same relationship. They are reaching for the same formula. In Philip, the name is given. In John, the name has been removed. Spinoza, in the Tractatus, working through parallel source traditions in the Torah, developed what we now call source criticism, the practice of identifying distinct literary voices within a composite text by tracking vocabulary, formula, and inconsistency. The same method applied to these two documents points toward a common source tradition with a common identity that one document preserved and the other concealed. Let me take you into the scene that I think is the most important textual evidence in this entire argument. John 20, verses 1 through 18. The empty tomb. Read it closely. Not for theology, for structure. Mary Magdalene comes to the tomb alone while it is still dark. She finds the stone removed. She runs alone to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. She says, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb." Both disciples run to the tomb. The beloved disciple outruns Peter, arrives first, looks in and sees the burial cloths, but does not enter. Peter enters, sees the cloths and the face cloth rolled separately. Then the beloved disciple enters, and we are told he saw and believed. Both disciples then go home. Mary stays outside the tomb, weeping. Jesus appears to her. She does not recognize him until he speaks her name. He then gives her the commission, "Go and tell my brothers." Now, think about the structure of that scene as written. The two male disciples come, observe, believe in some sense, and go home. Mary stays. The risen Christ appears, not to the male disciples, not to the beloved disciple who just believed at the sight of the grave cloths, but to Mary. Mary receives the first resurrection appearance and the specific commission that follows it. If the beloved disciple is someone other than Mary Magdalene, you have the following structural absurdity. The person closest to Jesus, his most intimate disciple, the one Jesus loved above all, comes to the empty tomb, sees the evidence, believes, and leaves. And the first resurrection appearance, the defining moment of Christianity, goes not to this closest disciple, but to a secondary character who happened to be weeping nearby. That is incoherent narrative. Gospel writers, whatever else they were doing, were not incoherent. But if Mary Magdalene is the beloved disciple, if verse 2 is a late editorial insert, artificially separating into two characters what was originally one, the scene becomes perfectly coherent. Mary comes to the tomb. Mary runs to tell the community. Mary returns. Mary stays. Mary receives the first resurrection appearance. Mary is commissioned. The witness circle is complete and closed. The incoherence is the seam, the place where the editorial hand stitched two identities where there was originally one. And Spinoza in chapter 7 of the Tractatus states plainly, where a text creates logical contradiction in the flow of narrative, the interpreter must ask whether the contradiction was introduced rather than inherited, not inherited from an original complex reality, introduced by an editor managing a problem. The problem was Mary's gender. Here is what the church stood to lose. If the beloved disciple was Mary Magdalene, then the fourth gospel is her gospel, not in some loose metaphorical sense, in the specific structural founding witness sense. The Gospel of John derives its authority from the testimony of the beloved disciple. John 21 verse 24 says so explicitly. If the beloved disciple is Mary Magdalene, then one of the four canonical Gospels rests not on an apostle, but on the witness of the woman the church would spend the next 1500 years treating as peripheral. And there is another layer. In 591 AD, Pope Gregory I delivered a homily in which he declared that Mary Magdalene was the sinful woman of Luke 7, the woman who wept at Jesus' feet, described only as a sinner in the city. He merged her with Mary of Bethany, Lazarus' sister. He merged three separate women from the gospel narratives into one composite figure and declared that composite to be a reformed prostitute. The Vatican did not formally correct this mistake until 1969. 1400 years of error, officially uncorrected. 1400 years of the church calling the founding witness of its most theological gospel a prostitute. The irony is not subtle. The church used the Gospel of John, her gospel if Husino and the textual evidence are right, to teach a theology that excluded women from authority, while simultaneously and systematically erasing the identity of the woman from whom that gospel derived its authority in the first place. Spinoza's framing in the Tractatus for why institutions do what they do Whoever holds sovereignty holds the right of interpretation. What is inconvenient to the sovereign will not be interpreted as commanded. The church held sovereignty over the canon. The beloved disciples' identity was inconvenient, and so it was managed. Not conspiratorially. These things rarely are. More the way water finds the lowest point, the path of least institutional resistance, which in the 2nd century ran straight toward a male founding witness attached to a known apostle, and away from a woman who had already been quietly repositioned as a reformed sinner. I want to be precise about what I am claiming and what I am not. I am not claiming proof. There is no document that surfaces from the 2nd century with the words, "We removed Mary Magdalene's name from the beloved disciple" passages. These things do not leave confessions. They leave seams, patterns, absences that have the shape of presence. What I am claiming is that the evidence, assembled carefully, points in a specific direction that the traditional attribution cannot explain. John, son of Zebedee, cannot account for his near-total absence from the gospel that supposedly carries his witness. Lazarus cannot account for his presence at the cross while being a hunted man. Mary Magdalene accounts for the resurrection scene structure perfectly. She accounts for the Gospel of Philip's parallel language. She accounts for why the Johannine community gave her the singular authority of the first resurrection commission. She accounts for the extraordinary prominence, narrative prominence, not sentimental prominence, that no other gospel gives her. And she accounts for why someone in the 2nd century would have found the beloved disciples' identity inconvenient. When I sat in that library with Brown's footnote and the stranger's penciled question in the margin, what I felt was something I've come to recognize. The feeling when the last piece of a pattern becomes visible, but requires you to accept something that will cost you something, not intellectually, emotionally. Because if the beloved disciple was Mary Magdalene, then a great deal of what was built on the Gospel of John was built on a concealed foundation. And the woman at the foundation, the one whose name was removed, whose testimony was kept, but whose identity was buried, spent 1400 years being called a prostitute by the institution that was built on what she saw. That is not a minor correction. That is a load-bearing wall coming down. We do not know for certain. I want to be honest about that. The certainty is not there. The manuscript with her name has not surfaced. The redactor's letter of explanation has not been found. What we have is a text that behaves exactly the way Husino says it should behave if an editorial hand changed one identity to another. What we have is a parallel source tradition that preserved the name. What we have is a resurrection scene whose logic only holds if the anonymous figure and the named witness are the same person. And we have a church that spent 1400 years making sure no one looked too carefully. Raymond E. Brown did not follow the question past his footnote. Someone in a library somewhere penciled the question in the margin, and it sat there for 30 years until a retired history teacher from Tennessee happened to check out the same book. The anonymity was never modesty. The anonymity was a decision. And the name that was buried, spoken 5 times in the most intimate moments of the gospel, reclined against Jesus at supper, standing at the foot of the cross, first at the empty tomb, first to hear her name in the voice she recognized. That name deserves to be spoken. We don't know for certain, but we know they had a reason to hide it, and we know what that reason looked like.